It was not a sound, but a resonance. A deep, thrumming chord that struck through the marrow of her bones and sang out in the vast, vaulted throne room. For one crystalline moment, the world stopped. The murmur of the assembled court, the distant hiss of torches, the rustle of silk and velvet, all of it fell away, leaving only the singular, ringing note of connection. Ilara felt it as a sudden, impossible warmth spreading from the center of her chest, a sun blooming in the hollow space beneath her ribs. Her gaze, which had been fixed on the polished marble floor, lifted, pulled by a force as undeniable as gravity. It found him. King Caitian. He stood on the dais, a figure carved from shadow and moonlight. The ancient crown of the night caught a jagged circlet of obsidian on his brow. The bond, this myth, this legend whispered by hopeful humans and scornful vampires alike, had chosen him. And it had chosen her, a librarian's daughter from a forgotten provincial town, brought to the capital as part of the annual human tithe. Across the cavernous space that separated them, his silver eyes, usually as cool and remote as distant stars, were wide. He felt it too. She knew he did. The shock was a mirror, reflecting her own disbelief back at her. A shared silence, a shared breath in a room full of people. It was the most intimate thing she had ever known. Hope, terrifying and brilliant, surged through her. This was the promise of the bond, a perfect seeing, a perfect knowing. An end to loneliness. Then, it broke. The moment shattered like glass. Caitian's expression, so briefly open, shuttered closed. A mask of cold, imperial indifference slammed down, so swift and total it was as if the flicker of connection had never happened. He straightened his shoulders, the motion subtle but absolute. His gaze slid from her, dismissing her, erasing her, moving on to the Duke of Ashfall who stood beside him. He inclined his head, a gesture of regal consultation, and the world rushed back in. The Duke bowed. The court stirred, their whispers returning, now sharp and venomous. The warmth in Ilara's chest turned to ice. The sun that had bloomed there collapsed into a tiny, dense point of pain. He had felt it. He had felt the single greatest miracle of their two peoples, the thing poets wrote of and historians chronicled, and he had turned his back on it. On her. She stood frozen, a statue of humiliation in the center of the great hall. Every eye was on her now, not with awe, but with a horrifying, dissecting pity. She was a curiosity. A scandal. The human girl who had forged a bond with a king who clearly wanted nothing to do with her. Her dress, a simple thing of dark blue wool, felt coarse and plain amidst the court splendor. Her hands, clasped before her, began to tremble. She wanted to run, to disappear, to melt into the cold stone floor, but her feet were rooted to the spot. The bond, which a moment ago had felt like a golden thread of light, now felt like a chain, tethering her to the source of her shame. From the corner of her eye, she could see him, still standing on the dais, a portrait of unbothered sovereignty. He did not look at her again. He did not have to. The message had been sent, received not just by her, but by every vampire, every courtier, every servant in the room. She was nothing. The silence around her became a physical pressure, the weight of 1,000 unspoken judgments. They saw her as an anchor, a weakness foisted upon their eternal, unassailable king. A human stain on his immaculate reign. The pain in her chest was no longer a point, but a sprawling, aching void. It was the feeling of a door being slammed shut in her face, the echo of the latch clicking into place reverberating through every part of her. A guard, his face impassive, eventually approached her. His voice was low, devoid of inflection. "This way, my lady." The title was a mockery, a bitter twist of the knife. He led her from the throne room, her steps stiff and graceless. The eyes of the court followed her, a physical weight on her back. She did not look back at the dais. She could not bear to see the king's profile, his perfect, cruel indifference. As the great oaken doors closed behind her, cutting off the torchlight and the whispers, she was left with only two things: the chilling silence of the empty corridor, and the agonizing, one-sided hum of a bond that sang only of rejection. 6 days now. 6 days since she had been escorted to these opulent chambers, a gilded cage where she was left to slowly, quietly suffocate. The rooms were beautiful, of course. The bed was draped in silks the color of a bruised twilight, the carpets were thick and soft, and a fire was always lit in the marble hearth, its flames doing nothing to warm the profound chill that had settled deep within her. Meals arrived on silver trays, untouched. Gowns of impossible beauty were laid out by silent maids, unworn. It was the careful, meticulous hospitality one might afford a guest of immense importance or a prisoner on the verge of execution. Ilara wasn't sure which she was. The bond was a constant, physical presence. It was a low, persistent ache behind her sternum, a phantom limb that reached for something that was not there. Sometimes, it would flare without warning. A sudden, sharp spike of irritation, not her own, would lance through her while she was staring out the window at the perpetually grey sky. A wave of profound, weary exhaustion would wash over her in the middle of the afternoon, making her limbs feel like lead. They were his emotions, she knew. Faint, distorted echoes of the king's inner world, bleeding through the connection he refused to acknowledge. They were phantom pains, ghosts of a conversation they would never have. He was avoiding her with a diligence that was, in itself, a form of attention. She learned his rhythms through the whispers of the bond. She knew when he was in counsel, the irritation sharpening to a fine, angry point. She knew when he was in the training yards, a thread of controlled violence humming beneath the surface. And she knew when he was alone, late at night, when a vast and ancient loneliness would seep through the cracks in his armor, an emotion so akin to her own that it made the ache in her chest unbearable. It was a cruel intimacy, to feel his solitude but be denied his presence. The court had taken its cue from its king. In the few, terrifying instances she had dared to venture from her rooms, she was met with a wall of perfect, polite disregard. Courtiers' eyes would slide past her as if she were a piece of furniture. Conversations would halt as she approached, resuming only after she had passed. They did not insult her. They did not threaten her. They simply rendered her invisible, a far more devastating cruelty. She was a ghost haunting the edges of their glittering, eternal world. One afternoon, desperate for a space that did not feel like a velvet-lined tomb, she found her way to the Royal Library. It was a place she had dreamed of, a sanctuary of paper and ink. The scent of old parchment and leather was the closest thing to home she had found in this cold, stone fortress. The library was immense, a cathedral of books rising 3 stories high, with spiraling iron staircases and narrow balconies. It was also empty. She ran a trembling hand over the spines of the books, the familiar texture a small, solid comfort. Here, at least, was a silence that was peaceful, not punishing. She was reaching for a slim volume of poetry when a subtle shift in the bond made her freeze. It was not an emotion this time, but a sense of proximity. A quiet sharpening of the connection, a thrum of awareness that told her he was near. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She held her breath, listening. The library was silent, save for the whisper of the fire in the grand fireplace at the far end of the room. And then she saw him. Cation was on one of the upper balconies, half hidden in the shadows. He wasn't looking at a book. He was looking down, directly at her. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone, but the bond told a different story. It pulsed with a complex, warring current of frustration, possessiveness, and something else, something that felt dangerously like longing. It was a torrent of feeling, all the more powerful for being so fiercely repressed. Her breath caught. This was it. He would come down. He would speak to her. He had to. The sheer force of his attention was a physical thing, pinning her in place. She waited, her entire being focused on that shadowed figure. Seconds stretched into an eternity. The hope that she had tried so hard to murder rose again, a stubborn, foolish weed. And then, as slowly as he had appeared, he stepped back. The shadows swallowed him whole. The intense pressure of the bond lessened, receding back to its dull, familiar ache. He was gone. He had been there, he had seen her, he had felt, whatever it was he had felt, and he had chosen, once again, to walk away. The book of poetry slipped from her numb fingers and fell to the floor with a soft, defeated thud. The sound echoed in the vast, silent library, the perfect punctuation to her utter and complete despair. The tears she had refused to shed for 6 days finally came, hot and silent, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. He would not claim her. He would not even speak to her. He would just watch her break from a distance, himself the architect of her pain. 3 weeks after her public humiliation, the unchanging gloom of the night court. A heavy parchment scroll with Caitian's severe, jagged signature and the dripping wax of his seal, a snarling wolf's head. He had handed it to her himself. "See that this finds its way into your queen's hands," he had said. And she had. She had given it to the courier who took her own letters, a trusted man who had served her family for years. She had watched him place it in his satchel. "Tell me, Lady Alara," Caitian said, his voice slithering through the silence. "Where is that request now? Did it weigh down your courier's bag? Did you, perhaps, forget to give it to him at all? Or did you think it a matter of little importance? A trifle concerning the feeding of a few hundred peasants?" Every eye in the room turned to her. The courtiers, the guards, the terrified Lord Valerus. They saw her pale face, her trembling hands. They saw the king's incandescent rage focused entirely on her. And they saw a simple, convenient explanation for a diplomatic disaster. "Your Majesty, she began, her throat closing up. "I gave it to the courier. I saw him place it in his bag." "You saw him," Caitian repeated, his lip curling into a sneer. "And yet, the Queen of Sunstone never received it." A curious paradox. One might almost suspect a failure in the chain of command. A weak link. He rose from the throne, a slow, deliberate unfolding of coiled power. He descended the steps of the dais, each footfall a soft, menacing thud. He did not stop until he stood directly before her, forcing her to crane her neck to look up at him. The sheer height of him, the breadth of his shoulders, was overwhelming. "This misunderstanding could be seen as a breach of our treaty," he whispered, his voice for her ears alone, yet its venom seemed to poison the very air they breathed. "It could be seen as a provocation. Men will starve this winter because of your carelessness." He was blaming her for the coming winter, for the hunger of his people, for the potential collapse of a peace that had cost thousands of lives to forge. The scale of the accusation was so vast, so monstrously unjust, that something inside her, something that had been systematically crushed and compressed for 6 months, refused to shrink any further. It was the moment for her apology. It was the moment to fall to her knees, to beg forgiveness, to accept the crushing weight of this blame as she had accepted all the others. The entire court held its breath, waiting for the familiar cadence of the ritual. But the words would not come. Her throat was locked, not with fear, but with a sudden, searing bolt of defiance. Her mind raced back to the courier, a good man, stout and reliable. It flashed to Queen Isolde, her cousin, a pragmatic and honorable ruler who would never risk war over a delayed letter. There was a mistake somewhere, a lost message, a miscommunication. It was not her fault. And so, she did not apologize. She simply stood there, trapped in the freezing orbit of his rage, and met his gaze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror, but her eyes, for the first time, did not waver. She said nothing. She did not bow her head. She did not whisper her remorse. She just stood there, silent. The silence stretched, taut and shimmering with tension. 1 second. 2. 5. An eternity. Caitian's eyes narrowed. He had been expecting prostration, tears, the familiar currency of her submission. He had not been expecting nothing. Her silence was not empty, it was a wall. It was a refusal. A flicker of confusion, of sheer, startled disbelief, crossed his face before it was replaced by an even colder fury. But he had been denied his expected release. The ritual was broken. He had swung the executioner's axe, and it had met not a willing neck on the block, but thin air. "Get out of my sight," he hissed, turning his back on her with a sudden, violent motion, his black cloak swirling around him like a storm cloud. Alara did not need to be told twice. She turned, her legs feeling like hollow reeds, and walked from the throne room. She did not run. She walked, her back straight, her head held high. With every step, she felt the gazes of the entire court on her back, a mixture of shock, pity, and a strange, nascent respect. She did not look back. She had refused the blame, and in doing so, she had thrown a torch into the frozen, stagnant heart of the king's palace. She had no idea if it would illuminate the way forward, or simply burn everything to the ground. Caitian's fury did not manifest as a storm, but as a suffocating, absolute zero. 4 days, he was a void at the center of the citadel, a presence defined by his chilling absence. He did not attend meals. He did not hold court. The throne room doors remained sealed. The guards who stood watch outside his private wing reported hearing nothing, not a footstep, not a whisper, a silence so profound it was more terrifying than any roar. Ilara, in turn, was a ghost. The courtiers, unsure how to react to her unprecedented defiance, avoided her. They would flatten themselves against walls as she passed, their eyes fixed on some distant point, as if she were a carrier of a fatal, highly contagious disease. Her isolation, once a passive state, was now an active, enforced quarantine. In this new, profound solitude, something began to shift within her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach that never fully dissolved, but it was no longer the only thing. It was joined by a strange, sharp clarity. By refusing to be the vessel for his rage, she had been forced to set it down. And without its weight bending her spine, she could finally look up. She began to watch him. Not in person, for he was invisible, but she watched the effects of his existence. She saw the weariness in the face of the head housekeeper, a woman who had served 3 generations of mortal lords before the vampires came, as she tried to manage a household under the thumb of an unpredictable, grieving tyrant. She saw the nervous tics of the young scribe who had to draft the increasingly hostile dispatches to the Sunstone Queendom, his hand shaking as he wrote words that could lead to war. She saw the kingdom itself, a vast, complex machine being slowly ground to a halt by the unhappiness of the single man at its controls. And she began to wonder. She had always thought of his unhappiness as a weapon he wielded. Now, for the first time, she considered that it might be a cage he was trapped in. One evening, driven by a restlessness she couldn't quell, she wandered into the Grand Library. It was a place she usually avoided, for it was one of his favored haunts. But the need for something to fill the silence was greater than her fear of him. The library was a cathedral of knowledge, its shelves stretching up into a vaulted darkness where no torchlight could reach. It smelled of aged paper, leather, and that same coldstone scent that was uniquely his. He was there. She saw him at the far end of the central reading chamber, a solitary figure standing before a towering, floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the jagged peaks of the endless mountains. He was perfectly still, his back to her, a silhouette against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. She froze, her hand on a shelf of leather-bound histories, her first instinct to flee. But she stayed. Hidden in the shadows between 2 towering shelves, she watched him. He was not reading. He was not working. He was simply standing there, staring out at the unforgiving landscape his people called home. There was a slump to his shoulders she had never seen before, a subtle curve in his ramrod-straight spine that spoke not of power, but of an exhaustion so profound it was structural. He believed her responsible for a missing letter, a letter that could plunge 2 kingdoms into war. He had every right, by the laws of his own court, to imprison her, to execute her. And yet, he had done nothing. He had simply withdrawn. It was not the act of a tyrant enjoying his power. It was the act of a man flummoxed, a man whose world had tilted unexpectedly off its axis. Her refusal to play her part in his drama had left him without a scene partner, alone on a stage of his own making. From her hiding place, she saw him lift a hand and press the palm against the cold glass of the window. It was a gesture of immense loneliness, of a being trying to touch a world from which he was fundamentally separated. The gesture was not regal. It was not threatening. It was heartbreakingly human. For the first time, Ilara felt a flicker of something other than fear or defiance. It was a strange, unwelcome pang of empathy. She was looking at a king who held the power of life and death in his hands, a predator of terrifying strength and speed. But what she saw was a prisoner. He was a prisoner of his own immortality, a prisoner of a grief she could not begin to comprehend, a prisoner of a role he was forced to play. A floorboard creaked under her foot. He didn't turn. His posture didn't change. But his voice, low and resonant, drifted back to her through the cavernous space. The first rule of survival in a predator's den, little bird, is not to let it know you are watching. Her blood went cold. He had known she was there the entire time. The slump in his shoulders, the weary gesture, had it all been a performance for her benefit? A new, more subtle kind of manipulation? I was not watching, she lied, her voice tight. I was looking for a book. He turned then, slowly. In the dim light, his face was a mask of shadows, his eyes glowing with a soft, internal luminescence. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and there was no anger in his gaze. There was only a deep, unnerving curiosity. "And what book does a symbol of peace look for?" he asked, his voice laced with a faint, bitter irony, "when the peace is about to shatter?" She refused to be drawn into his game of guilt and insinuation. Not anymore. She lifted her chin, her gaze sweeping over the shelves beside her. "A history," she said, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know it possessed. "I wish to understand how things become broken." His lips parted in a semblance of a smile, but it held no humor. It was the grimace of a man who knew the subject all too well. "An ambitious topic," he said softly. "Most of these books will tell you of wars, and treaties, and betrayals. They will be wrong." He took a step away from the window, toward her. She held her ground, her hand gripping the spine of a heavy tome as if it were a shield. "Things do not break," he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a conspiratorial whisper that slid under her defenses. "They are hollowed out from the inside, slowly, over centuries. Until one day, a single breath, a single misplaced word, is all it takes for the shell to collapse." He stopped a few feet from her. He was talking about the treaty, about his kingdom. But Alara knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that he was also talking about himself. She was standing in the presence of a man who had been hollowed out by time, and he was finally, terrifyingly, admitting it. The blame he had heaped upon her was not a weapon, it was just him trying to fill the echoing emptiness inside himself with something, anything, even if it was someone else's fear. The knowledge was a terrible, fragile thing. It did not make her feel safe. But it did, for the first time, make her feel strong. The library became her sanctuary, but also her battleground. She returned every day, a deliberate act of claiming space. She would choose a book, a history, a book of maps, a treatise on architecture, and sit at one of the long, deserted reading tables, forcing herself to concentrate on the words, to block out the oppressive silence of the citadel. It was an act of rebellion so quiet no one else would have noticed it, but she knew Cation did. She could feel his awareness of her, a distant pressure at the edge of her senses. He never appeared in the library again, but his absence was a conversation in itself. Her newfound defiance needed an outlet, a place to put her hands to work. One afternoon, exploring a disused wing of the upper palace, she found it. Tucked away behind a crumbling terrace was an old aviary, a delicate structure of rusted iron and grimy glass. Most of the cages were empty, their doors hanging open like mouths locked in a silent scream. But in a few, there were survivors. A pair of pale mountain finches, a solitary grey dove with a broken wing, and a magnificent but sullen raven who watched her with an intelligence that felt unnervingly ancient. They were neglected, forgotten. Their water dishes were slimy with algae, their seed trays nearly empty. They were prisoners, just as she was. A fierce, protective instinct rose in her. That evening, she stole a handful of grains and a piece of bread from the kitchens. The next morning, at dawn, she crept back to the aviary. The birds scattered in fear as she approached, but she moved slowly, murmuring to them in a low, soft voice. She cleaned the filthy water dishes and refilled them from a nearby fountain. She crumbled the bread and scattered the grain. The raven watched her every move, its head cocked. The finches chirped nervously. The dove huddled in a corner, its good eye fixed on her. She did not try to touch them. She simply tended to their needs and then left. She came back every day. It became her secret ritual, a counterpoint to the king's broken one. She was no longer just absorbing his misery, she was creating a tiny pocket of care in the midst of his cold, unhappy kingdom. She learned the birds' habits. The finches liked the morning sun. The dove, whom she named Ash, would eventually hobble forward to eat from her hand. The raven, whom she called Midnight, remained aloof, but he would sometimes let out a low, gravelly croak when she arrived, a sound she chose to interpret as a greeting. For 2 weeks, Her secret remained her own. The aviary became her haven, the only place in the entire citadel where she did not feel the weight of the king's gaze. Then, one afternoon, as she was carefully wrapping a fresh bandage around Ash's broken wing, a shadow fell over her. She looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. Cation stood in the arched doorway of the aviary, silhouetted against the bright, cold sky. He was as still as the stone gargoyles that lined the palace roof, his expression unreadable. He had found her. The one small corner of the world she had carved out for herself had been discovered. She expected anger, an accusation of theft for the grain, a pronouncement that she was wasting her time on useless creatures. She braced herself for the familiar onslaught. He said nothing. He simply walked into the aviary, his boots making no sound on the stone flags. He moved past her, his gaze sweeping over the cages, noting the clean water, the scattered seed, the mended perch. His eyes, those burning crimson embers, lingered on the raven, who stared back at him without fear. "These creatures are not yours to tend," he said at last. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Ilara's hands, which had been gentle on the dove's wing, tightened. She forced them to relax, carefully placing Ash back in his cage before she stood to face the king. She was done with shrinking. "They belong to no one," she said, her voice clear and steady. "They are merely here. As am I." The statement hung in the air between them, shimmering with unspoken meaning. She was not just a bird in a cage. She was a living being, and she had needs, a will, a purpose of her own, even if it was just to care for other broken things. Cation's gaze shifted from the raven to her. He studied her face, his head tilted slightly, like a hawk assessing its prey. Or, she thought with a sudden jolt, like a scholar encountering an utterly unexpected theorem. "You have been stealing from my kitchens," he stated. It was an accusation, but it lacked the usual venom. It was a simple observation. The old Ilara would have stammered an apology. The new Ilara held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "They were hungry. And you believe their hunger gives you the right to steal from a king?" "I believe no creature under your protection should starve," she countered, her own words surprising her with their boldness. "Whether they have 2 legs or 2 wings." A muscle twitched in his jaw. She had turned his own logic against him, the logic he had used to condemn her over the missing grain shipment. She was holding up a mirror, and he was being forced to look. He looked away from her, his eyes settling on the dove with its freshly bandaged wing. He watched it for a long, silent moment. The only sounds were the soft cooing of the dove and the distant cry of the wind whistling through the mountain peaks. "The wing is poorly set," he said, his voice quiet. "It will heal, but the bird will never fly again." It was a cruel thing to say, a typical, casual cut. But the tone was wrong. It wasn't dismissive. It sounded sad. It was a diagnosis from someone who understood broken things. He turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. He looked back at her, his face half in shadow. "The raven," he said. "His name is Dola. He belonged to my father. He has been here for 900 years. Be careful what you say to him. He remembers everything." And then he was gone. Ilara stood frozen, her heart pounding. He had not punished her. He had not forbidden her from coming here. He had corrected her on the raven's name. He had given her a piece of his history, a tiny, sharp-edged shard of his past. She looked at the raven, at midnight, whose name was actually Dola, Sorrow. He remembered everything. She had a sudden, chilling thought that in this palace, she was not the only one tending to an ancient, broken creature who had forgotten how to fly. The confrontation in the aviary, or the lack of one, left Cation adrift. He retreated to his private chambers, a suite of rooms carved from the mountain's heart, where the only windows were narrow slits that let in slivers of grey light. For a day and a night, he did not feed. He did not sleep. He simply sat in a high-backed chair, the silence of the stone pressing in on him. Ilara's words echoed in the quiet. "They are merely here. As am I." A simple statement that had somehow disarmed him more effectively than any weapon. For centuries, everyone in his orbit had existed in relation to him, as a servant, a subject, a tool, an enemy. He set the terms of every interaction. But she had stepped outside that framework. She had defined herself and her actions on her own terms, however small. She had refused to be a character in his tragedy. She was writing her own, a quiet little story about forgotten birds. It was infuriating. And it was intriguing. His mind, usually a fortress of discipline, began to wander. It slipped its leash, sliding back through the centuries, past the wars and the treaties, past the long, lonely decades of his kingship, back to a time before the crown, before the grief had become a permanent part of his anatomy. He found himself in another garden, one not of pale, spectral blooms, but of vibrant, living color. A human garden, riotous with sunlight and the scent of damp earth and honeysuckle. And he saw Lyra. His wife. His queen. Gone for 512 years. She was nothing like Alara. Lyra had been fire and laughter, with hair the color of sunset and a life force that burned so brightly he had been terrified it would consume itself. And it had. A human fever, a simple, stupid sickness that her body could not fight, had stolen her from him in the space of a week. He, who could command armies and tear a man in two with his bare hands, had been able to do nothing but hold her hand and watch the light fade from her eyes. His grief had been a cataclysm. It had remade him. He had sealed off the sunlit gardens, raised the southern wing where they had lived, and built this cold, stone citadel on the bones of his old life. He had become the king his sorrow demanded, remote, unfeeling, eternal. And for 500 years, he had been punishing the world for her absence. He had not realized it so clearly until now. He looked at the long, pale line of his hand resting on the arm of the chair, and he saw it resting on a book of maps beside Alara. He heard his own voice, cold and cruel, blaming her for the scent of flowers, and he remembered Lyra weaving garlands of those same flowers in her hair. He remembered his accusation about the missing letter, his pronouncement that men would starve. He had been testing her, he realized. He had been testing her to see if she would break, to see if she was as fragile as Lyra had been. He had been daring her to die. And she had refused. She had refused to apologize for the scent of flowers. She had refused to accept blame for a war she did not cause. She had looked him, the monster of her world, in the eye and told him she had a right to exist, a right to care for other broken things. She was not Lyra. She was not fire and laughter. She was quiet, resilient, like a stubborn mountain weed pushing its way through a crack in the stone. She did not burn, she endured. A low sound escaped his throat, a rough, rusty noise he barely recognized as a laugh. It was a sound of pure, bitter irony. For 6 months, he had been blaming Alara for his unhappiness, for the gaping void Lyra's death had left in him. He had made her the scapegoat for a 500-year-old wound. He had used her as a proxy for a world that had taken his joy and left him with only eternity. He had been trying to force her into the shape of his grief. And she had simply stepped aside. He rose from the chair and walked to one of the narrow windows. He looked out at the jagged peaks, their tips frosted with snow under the light of a cold moon. He had chosen this place, this fortress of ice and stone, because it was a perfect reflection of what he had become. He had made his kingdom into a monument to his own misery. Now, a girl who smelled of breadcrumbs and birdseed had held up a mirror, and the reflection was not of a fearsome king, but of a pathetic, grieving man lashing out at a ghost. She was not the source of his unhappiness. She was merely the first person in half a millennium who had refused to participate in it. He thought of her in the aviary, her small, determined hands tending to a broken dove. "I believe no creature under your protection should starve." She had spoken of his duty, the duty he had long since abandoned in favor of his own private suffering. He was the king. This was his kingdom. And it was broken. Hollowed out from the inside. He had said the words himself, but only now did he understand them. He had been the one hollowing it out. He rested his forehead against the freezing stone of the wall. The cold seeped into his skin, a familiar, unwelcome comfort. For the first time in a very long time, he did not think about what he had lost. He thought about the small, quiet girl in the aviary. And he felt a flicker of something he had thought long dead. Not happiness. Not hope. Something far more fragile and far more dangerous, curiosity. He wanted to know what she would do next. The king's silence continued, but its texture changed. The oppressive, angry weight lifted, replaced by something still and watchful. The court, sensing the shift, began to breathe a little easier. Ilara, however, felt more exposed than ever. The absence of his anger was more unnerving than its presence. It was like living on a mountainside after a rockslide. The immediate danger was past, but the ground felt unstable, ready to give way at any moment. She continued her daily trips to the aviary. It was no longer a secret, and she felt the invisible weight of his knowledge with every step. But he did not interfere. Punishment did not come. Instead, small, inexplicable things began to happen. A sack of high-quality birdseed appeared one morning outside the aviary door. A roll of clean linen for bandages was left on a bench. A carpenter appeared and, without a word, repaired the rusted hinges on the cages and replaced the grimy panes of glass. No one acknowledged these gifts. No one spoke of them. They were like offerings left at a silent altar. Ilara didn't know how to interpret them. Were they a tacit approval? Or a more subtle form of control, a reminder that even this small world of hers was subject to his whims? She decided, for her own sanity, to treat them as she treated the birds, as things that were simply there. She used the seed. She used the linen. She was grateful for the repairs. And she said nothing. One evening, she lingered in the aviary longer than usual. A storm was rolling in from the north, and the sky had turned a deep, bruised violet. The wind howled around the small glass building, making it moan and shudder. She was making sure the cages were secure, her hands moving with a new, quiet confidence. The door opened. It was him. He wasn't a silhouette this time. He was just there, standing in the gloom, the wind whipping his black cloak around his legs. He had a small, leather-bound book in his hand. He did not look at her, but at the raven, Dola, who was perched silently in his cage, watching the storm. "He enjoys the wind," Cation said. His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual layers of command and irony. It was just a voice. "He says it carries the memories of the mountains." Ilara froze, her hand on the latch of the finch's cage. She had never heard him speak in such a plain, declarative way. She searched for the trap in his words, the hidden barb, and found none. "You can understand him?" she asked, her own voice barely a whisper. "Of a sort," Cation replied, his gaze still on the ancient bird. "His thoughts are not words. They are images, feelings. Cold. Hunger. The memory of flight." He paused. "Loneliness." He finally looked at her. In the dim, stormy light, his eyes seemed less like embers and more like pools of dark wine. "As I recall, you wish to understand how things become broken." He held out the book. Hesitantly, she moved toward him and took it. It was a thin volume, its leather cover worn smooth with age. There was no title. "This is a book of poetry," he said. "Written by a mortal woman who lived in these mountains 1,000 years ago. She loved them. She saw beauty in their cruelty." Ilara's fingers tightened on the book. A gift. Not a sack of seed left anonymously, but a thing given directly from his hand to hers. It was a bridge. A fragile, terrifying bridge thrown across the chasm of silence and fear that separated them. She didn't know if she dared to cross it. "Why are you giving this to me?" she asked, the question blunt. A strange expression flickered across his face. It might have been surprise at her directness. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "I am weary of conversations about broken things. Perhaps I thought you might be, too." They stood in silence for a long moment, the howl of the wind and the soft rustle of the bird's wings the only sounds. The silence was different now. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of his anger, nor the ringing silence of his absence. It was an expectant silence. A space waiting to be filled. "What is the name of the finches?" he asked, his gaze drifting to the cage where the two pale birds huddled together. The question was so simple, so normal, it caught her completely off guard. I don't know," she stammered. "I never named them." "You named the dove," he pointed out. "Ash." He remembered. The thought sent a strange shiver through her. He had listened. He had retained that small, insignificant detail. "The dove was alone," she said, finding her voice. The finches have each other. They did not seem to need names from me. Cation considered this. He looked from the pair of finches back to the solitary raven, Dola. The unspoken connection hung in the air. Loneliness required a name, an identity. Companionship did not. A sound observation, he said softly. He gave a slight, formal nod, a gesture so stiff and unfamiliar it was almost awkward. Enjoy the poetry, Lady Alara. He turned and left as quietly as he had come, the door closing with a soft click behind him, leaving her alone with the storm, the birds, and the book. She sank down onto a bench, the leather of the book cool and smooth beneath her fingers. He had come to her sanctuary not with a threat, but with a gift. He had asked a question not to trap her, but because he seemed to genuinely want to know the answer. He had spoken her name. She opened the book. On the first page, in elegant, faded ink, was a single inscription. To Lyra. May you always see the beauty. Ilara's breath caught in her chest. Lyra. The name from the library of his memories, the hollowed-out space inside him. This was not just a book. It was a relic. A piece of his shattered heart. And he had just placed it in her hands. She closed the book, clutching it to her chest as the storm broke outside, the wind and rain lashing against the glass like a grief that could no longer be contained. The fragile truce held for a week, a period of strange, watchful peace. The court began to function again. Cation presided over his council, his demeanor remote but no longer actively malevolent. Ilara took her meals in the great hall, and while the courtiers still gave her a wide berth, the overt shunning had ceased. She was no longer a pariah, but an enigma. And then the wolves came. Word arrived from the northern border posts, reports of skirmishes and raids. Not a full-scale invasion, but a series of swift, brutal attacks on outlying farms and lumber camps. The attackers were wolf shifters from the Ironwood clan, an ancient and notoriously proud people with whom the vampire kingdom had maintained a tense, centuries-old peace. The war council was convened in an atmosphere of grim urgency. Ilara was not present, but she heard the echoes of it throughout the citadel. Shouted voices from behind the council chamber's heavy oak doors. The sharp, angry scrape of chairs. Cation's voice, a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the others, silencing them. Later that day, she saw the result. The King's Guard, the elite corps of his army, began to assemble in the main courtyard, their black steel armor gleaming, their faces set in grim lines. Banners were unfurled, bearing the snarling wolf's head of the royal house. It was a show of force, a preparation for retaliation. War, which had been a threat on parchment, was about to become a reality of blood and steel. That night, unable to sleep, Ilara found herself drawn to the library. The book of poetry Cation had given her was in her hands, a comforting, familiar weight. She sought solace in the vast, quiet space, but it was not empty. Cation was there, standing before a massive table on which a map of the northern territories was unrolled. He was alone, dressed not in his formal court attire, but in simple black trousers and a tunic that allowed for a freedom of movement she had never seen in him. He looked less like a king and more like a soldier. He was staring down at the map, his hands braced on the table, his entire posture radiating a familiar, tightly coiled rage. The fragile peace was gone. The hollowed-out man was filling himself back up with fury, the only emotion he seemed to trust. She almost retreated, but something made her stay. She had seen this anger before, but now she understood it differently. It was not just cruelty, it was a defense. It was his armor. They will pay for this insolence, he said, without looking up. He knew she was there. I will burn their forest to the ground and salt the earth. His voice was terrifying in its cold certainty. This was the king who had ruled for centuries, the one who had built his reputation on swift and merciless retribution. Ilara walked forward until she stood on the other side of the table. She looked down at the map. Her finger, small and pale next to his, traced the border. She saw the locations of the raids, marked with small, crimson pins. They weren't random. They were clustered in one specific area, the foothills of the Silent Sisters, a trio of mountains held sacred by the Ironwood shifters. This is not an invasion, she said quietly. Cation looked up, his eyes blazing. They have drawn our blood. They have burned our farms. Do not lecture me on the nature of war, girl. I am not, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She tapped the map. Look. All the attacks are here, along the edge of their sacred lands. The old treaty, the one my grandmother helped negotiate, it granted your people logging rights in these foothills, but it forbade any permanent settlement. The farms that were burned, are they new? Caitian's eyes narrowed. He followed her finger, his gaze sweeping over the map. He said nothing, but she saw the flicker of understanding in his expression. The farms were new. Small settlements of the citadel's growing mortal population, pushing into lands that had been left fallow for a century. It is not an act of war, Elara continued, pressing her small advantage. It is a warning. A protest. They are not trying to take your land. They are trying to remind you of a promise your grandfather made. She took a breath. If you retaliate with the full force of your army, you will be starting a war, not finishing one. A war that will be fought over a misunderstanding. Over a broken promise. She fell silent, her heart pounding. She had challenged his military strategy, his authority as a commander. She had, in front of him, displayed a knowledge of his own kingdom's history that his advisors had apparently forgotten or been too afraid to mention. He stared at her, his face a mask of stone. The silence stretched, thick with the scent of old paper and new tension. She had expected him to erupt, to banish her, to accuse her of sympathizing with the enemy. Instead, he slowly, deliberately, straightened up. He looked from the map to her face, his gaze analytical, searching. He was seeing her not as a hostage, not as a woman, but as a strategist. An unexpected piece on the board. The Ironwood Alpha is a man named Fenrir, he said, his voice stripped of its earlier rage, now cold and contemplative. He is old, proud, and respects nothing but strength. He will not listen to a raven carrying a message. He will see it as weakness. Then don't send a raven, Elara said, her own boldness shocking her. Go yourself. An envoy. Not with an army at your back, but with a handful of guards. Show him the strength of a king who is not afraid to speak to his neighbors. The strength of a king who honors his word. Another long silence. Caitian walked around the table until he stood beside her. She had to tilt her head back to see his face. He was studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. That, he said, his voice a low murmur, is an exceptionally dangerous idea. All peace is dangerous, she whispered, quoting a line from the book of poetry he had given her. A corner of his mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. It was a devastatingly unfamiliar sight. Indeed, he said. He looked back at the map, at the crimson pins marking the path to war. Then he looked at her. The council will be reconvened at dawn. The army will be ordered to stand down. He paused, his crimson eyes locking onto hers. The envoy will depart at noon. Pack a bag. You are coming with me. The command was absolute, and it sent a shockwave of terror and something else, something wild and thrilling, through her. He was not just listening to her. He was making her a part of the answer. She had wanted to understand how things become broken. He was inviting her to help him put a piece of his world back together. The journey north was a stark and silent affair. The envoy consisted of only a dozen of the king's guard, Caitian, and, inexplicably, Elara. She rode a small, sturdy mountain mare, wrapped in furs against the biting wind. Caitian rode a massive black warhorse at the head of the column, a silent, imposing figure who seemed to merge with the grim landscape. They traveled for 2 days through jagged passes and snow-dusted pine forests, the silence broken only by the crunch of hooves on frozen ground and the cry of the wind. On the evening of the second day, the sky, which had been a sheet of iron gray, turned black. A blizzard descended upon them with shocking speed, a blinding wall of white that reduced visibility to near zero. They were forced to abandon the trail and seek shelter in a cluster of ancient ruins. Elara had spotted from the path the crumbling remains of an old watchtower. It was a miserable, cramped space. The guards huddled together for warmth near the entrance, trying to coax a small, sputtering fire to life. Caitian led Elara deeper into the ruin, into the base of the tower itself, which offered slightly more protection from the howling wind. It was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of damp stone and decay. A small globe of crimson light bloomed in Caitian's palm, casting long, dancing shadows on the curved walls. It was his magic, raw and untamed, and it illuminated his face from below, carving sharp angles into his features. "We will wait out the storm here," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. Ilara nodded, pulling her furs tighter around her. The cold was profound, a living thing that gnawed at her bones. She shivered, and a tremor ran through her entire body. Caitian looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "You are cold." It was a statement, not a question. "I will be fine," she said, her teeth chattering despite her best efforts. He moved closer. The heat that radiated from him was a shock, a furnace in the midst of the ice. He had always been cold before, his presence chilling any room he entered. But here, in the freezing dark, his unnatural vitality was a source of warmth. He stood before her for a moment, and then, with a hesitation she would not have thought him capable of, he unclasped his heavy, fur-lined cloak. He draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was immense, a crushing burden that smelled of leather, cold air, and him. But the warmth was immediate, seeping into her frozen limbs, chasing away the shivers. It was like being wrapped in the night itself. "Thank you," she whispered, stunned by the gesture. He gave a curt nod, turning away to stare into the darkness as if embarrassed by his own brief moment of compassion. They stood in silence for a long time, the only sound the shriek of the wind outside the tower walls. The intimacy of the moment was suffocating. They were alone, trapped, stripped of their roles as king and hostage, reduced to two people seeking shelter from a storm. "There was one before you," he said suddenly, his voice low and rough. He did not look at her. He spoke to the shadows. A queen. Human. Her name was Lyra. Ilara's breath caught. He was speaking of her. The ghost who haunted every room of the citadel, the name in the book of poetry. "She died," he continued, his voice flat, recounting a fact from a history book. "A fever. In my arms. I, who have seen empires fall and mountains turn to dust, could not stop a simple sickness from consuming her." He fell silent. The crimson light in his hand wavered. "I am becoming a monster, Ilara," he whispered, and the sound of her name in his mouth, spoken in a moment of such raw vulnerability, was a physical blow. "Her memory is fading. After 5 centuries, I find I can no longer perfectly recall the sound of her laugh. And in its place, there is only," this he gestured vaguely at the darkness, at the storm, at himself. "This coldness. This rage. I look at you, and I see your fragility, your mortality, and it enrages me. It reminds me of my failure." He finally turned to face her. In the crimson glow, she could see the profound, ancient grief etched onto his features. This was the source of his unhappiness. Not a flaw in his character, but a wound that had never healed, a wound he had been picking at for 500 years. "I have blamed you for a death you never knew," he said. "I have laid the ghost of my wife at your feet and demanded you carry her. There is no excuse for it. It is the act of a tyrant, and a coward." Ilara looked at him, at this terrifying, powerful being who was laying his shattered soul bare in a crumbling tower. Her fear of him, the constant companion of her last 6 months, dissolved, washed away by a sudden, overwhelming wave of empathy. He was not a monster. He was a man drowning in an ocean of time, and he had forgotten how to swim. She did something she never could have imagined. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. His muscles went rigid beneath the fabric of his tunic, a coil of immense power suddenly frozen. His skin was cool, but not cold. It was like touching marble that had been left in the sun. "Monsters do not fear becoming one," she said softly, her voice holding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "They do not mourn. And they do not remember the sound of laughter." His gaze dropped to her hand on his arm. He stared at it as if it were a foreign object, a thing of impossible wonder. The crimson light in his other hand pulsed, casting a warm, steady glow. The wind howled outside, but inside the tower, a profound stillness had fallen. Slowly, as if moving against a great and powerful current, he raised his free hand and covered hers. His fingers were long and cool, and they wrapped around her hand completely, engulfing it. It was not a gesture of possession or power. It was the touch of a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. It was the first time he had touched her, not in anger or by accident, but with intention. A quiet, desperate, and unmistakable plea for connection. And in the heart of the storm, surrounded by darkness, Ilara did not pull away. The storm broke at dawn, leaving the world scoured and silent, draped in a fresh blanket of snow. The meeting with the Ironwood clan was to take place in a clearing in the heart of the forest, a neutral ground. As they approached, Ilara could feel the tension in the air, a low hum of animal aggression. The wolves were here, unseen, watching them from the shadows of the trees. They entered the clearing. A great bonfire roared in the center, and around it stood the shifters. They were in their human forms, tall and powerfully built, dressed in furs and leather. Their leader, a formidable man with a wild grey beard and eyes the color of winter sky, stepped forward. Fenrir. The vampire king, the Alpha snarled, his voice a low growl. You dare come to our lands after your people break treaty and spill our blood? Kashan dismounted, his movements fluid and unhurried. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply stood before the Alpha, a king meeting a king. Ilara and the guards remained mounted behind him, a silent, watchful tableau. Your warriors raided my farms, Fenrir. Kashan's voice was calm, but it carried an unmistakable weight of authority that cut through the clearing. You spilled the blood of my subjects. Your subjects were on land forbidden to them by the old pact. Fenrir roared, his body tensing, the air around him shimmering as his rage threatened to overwhelm his human form. Your grandfather swore no farm or field would ever touch the feet of the Silent Sisters. You have broken your ancestors' promise. The promise was forgotten, Kashan said. Not deliberately broken. My scribes are old, and their memories are long, but not perfect. The expansion was an error. An error that will be corrected. Fenrir laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Easy words from a lying tongue. You think we are fools? You come here with your soft words only because you fear a war you cannot win. He spat on the ground. Your promises are worth less than the snow on the ground. They melt away with the seasons. We shifters remember. We do not forget. Kashan's jaw tightened. Ilara saw the flicker in his eyes, the ancient predator stirring just beneath the surface. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. The guards behind her shifted, their hands moving to the hilts of their swords. This was the moment it would all fall apart. The Alpha's pride, the king's rage, a spark in a powder keg. But then Kashan's gaze flickered, moving past the snarling Alpha for a fraction of a second, and finding her. She sat straight on her mare, Kashan's heavy cloak still around her shoulders. Her face was pale, her heart hammering, but her expression was steady. She met his gaze, and in that fleeting moment, a silent message passed between them. Monsters do not mourn. They do not remember. He took a slow, deliberate breath. The tension in his shoulders eased. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Softer. Devoid of the regal fury. You are right, he said. The entire clearing fell silent. Even Fenrir seemed stunned into stillness. You are right, Kashan repeated, his voice resonating with a truth that was more powerful than any threat. My people forgot. But I am the king. The failure is mine. I broke the promise. He unbuckled the sword from his hip, a magnificent weapon with a ruby pommel, the symbol of his kingship. He held it out, hilt first. This was my father's sword. And his father's before him. It has tasted the blood of your people in wars long past. I offer it to you now, not as a weapon, but as collateral. Hold it until every one of my new settlements is gone from your sacred foothills. Hold it until the land is returned to the way it was. It was an act of unimaginable humility. A vampire king, an immortal monarch, offering up his ancestral blade, admitting his error to a rival. It was not weakness. It was a display of strength so profound it left everyone breathless. It was the strength of a king secure enough in his power to admit fault. Fenrir stared at the sword, then at Kashan's face. He saw no trickery there, only a grave sincerity. He looked past Kashan at Ilara, a flicker of curiosity in his wolfish eyes. He seemed to understand that something fundamental had shifted, that this was not the same vampire king his father had fought. Slowly, the Alpha reached out and took the sword. He tested its weight, his expression unreadable. "The old pact also states," Fenrir said, his voice now a low rumble rather than a snarl, "that the logging rights in the lower woods must be renegotiated every century. It has been 120 years. Cation inclined his head. "Then we will renegotiate. Here." Now he gestured to the fire. "Bring us ale. We have much to discuss." The tension in the clearing did not vanish, but it transformed. It became the tension of a hard bargain about to be struck, not a battle about to be fought. Fenrir grunted an order, and two of his shifters brought out horns of ale. The journey back to the citadel was a different kind of silent. It was not the silence of anger or distance, but of contemplation. They rode side by side, Cation and Elara, the space between their horses smaller now. He had not taken his sword back, it remained with the Ironwood clan, a promise left in their hands. He seemed unconcerned, his posture relaxed, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. As the black spires of the citadel came into view, piercing the evening sky, he slowed his horse to a walk. "You were right," he said, echoing his own words from the clearing. He looked at her, and in the fading light, his crimson eyes were soft. "I was prepared to burn a forest to soothe my own pride. You showed me a different path. You were the one who chose to walk it," she replied quietly. "I have not had a guide for a very long time," he admitted. He reached across the space between them, his gloved hand moving with that same, slow deliberation she'd seen in the tower. He did not touch her. He took the reins of her mare, his fingers brushing against hers. He brought both their horses to a halt. "Elara," he said, and her name was no longer a confession or a discovery, but a statement. A fact. He held her gaze, and the whole world seemed to narrow to the space between them. "The blame was never yours. I know that now. It was a shield I used to hide from my own grief. A shield you forced me to lower." He did not apologize. His people did not apologize. But this was more than an apology. It was an admission. A reckoning. He nudged his horse closer, until their knees were almost touching. He still held her reins, a tangible connection between them. He did not let go. And as they rode the final stretch toward the looming gates of the citadel, a place that had been her prison, Elara felt the strange, terrifying, and unmistakable sensation of coming home. The return of the king, without his ancestral sword but with a renewed treaty, sent ripples of shock and speculation through the court. The story of what had transpired in the Ironwood, of the king's unprecedented admission of fault, was whispered in corridors and debated in private chambers. Cation did not speak of it. He simply moved through his duties with a new, quiet authority that was more formidable than his old rage had ever been. And Elara's status shifted entirely. She was no longer the forgotten hostage or the strange pariah. She was the woman who had ridden with the king and returned. She was an unknown quantity, a source of power and influence no one could yet measure. Courtiers who had once avoided her gaze now offered deep, respectful bows. The servants, who had always treated her with a fearful deference, now seemed to look at her with a kind of hopeful curiosity. She had not sought this power, but she had it all the same. The greatest change, however, was in the space between her and Cation. The dynamic of accuser and accused, of monster and victim, was gone, and they did not know what to put in its place. Their interactions became stilted, careful, fraught with the weight of all that had passed between them in the storm and the clearing. They were like two people from different countries who had just begun to learn each other's language. One evening, a week after their return, there was a soft knock on the door to her chambers. It was a sound she had never heard. Servants entered without knocking, and the king had never come to her rooms before. Her heart leaped. She opened the door to find him standing there. He was not in his formal regal attire, but in the simple dark tunic and trousers he'd worn on the journey. In his hands, he held a book. "I thought you might wish for something new to read," he said, his voice low. He seemed nervous. The vampire king, who had faced down armies and alpha wolves, seemed uncertain standing at her door. She stepped back, allowing him to enter. Her rooms were simple, comfortable, a small pocket of warmth in the cold stone palace. He walked into the center of the room and stopped, looking around as if seeing a foreign land for the first time. He held the book out to her. She took it. It was a heavy, leather-bound history, its title embossed in silver, a study of the wolf clans of the northern mountains. "So you are better informed than my counsel," he said. The corner of his mouth twitched. It was that ghost of a smile again, and this time it reached his eyes, making them glow. "Thank you," she said, her voice a little breathless. He did not leave. He gestured to the 2 chairs by the fireplace. "May I?" She nodded, her mind reeling. He sat, his large frame seeming to fill the small space, his long legs stretched out before him. He did not look like a king on a throne, but like a visitor, a guest in her home. She sat opposite him, the book resting in her lap. The fire crackled in the hearth. The silence between them was no longer tense or expectant, but comfortable. "Easy. The conservatory is in disarray," he commented, his gaze on the fire. "The phantom roses have overgrown their beds." Ilara's hands tightened on the book. This was familiar territory, the beginning of the old ritual. She braced herself. "I have been occupied," she said carefully. He turned his head to look at her, and there was no blame in his eyes. Only a quiet understanding. "Yes," he said. "You have." He paused. "I find I miss the scent of the moon petals." The admission was so simple, so direct, it stole her breath. He was rewriting their history, scene by scene. He was taking the moments of her deepest humiliation and recasting them as something new. "They can be cultivated again," she said. "Perhaps," he said. "Perhaps we could cultivate them together." The offer hung in the air between them, an invitation not just to garden, but to build something new in the ruins of the old. A partnership. He leaned forward slightly, his crimson eyes full of a gravity that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the present moment. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, not as a symbol, not as a ghost, but as herself. "Tell me your name again," he said softly. The question was absurd. He knew her name. He had said it in the tower, on the road. But she understood what he was asking. He was asking her to reintroduce herself, to begin again, here, in this room, on their own terms. "Ilara," she said, her voice clear and strong. He tasted the name, his lips forming the syllables with care. "Ilara," he said it not like a king, but like a man learning a prayer. "Ilara." The sound of her own name, spoken in his voice, was no longer a weapon used against her or a secret whispered in the dark. It was a foundation. The first stone laid for a new story, a story they would, perhaps, write.